April 22, 1941. A small windowless room in the munitions building on Constitution Avenue, Washington, D.C. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the mechanical clatter of IBM sorting machines. 6 men huddle around a sheet of paper covered in 5-digit number groups, rows and columns of meaningless integers that, to the uninitiated, might be mistaken for accounting ledgers or statistical tables. But here, in this cramped, stuffy chamber where the spring sunlight never reaches, these numbers represent something far more profound. They are the pulse of an empire, the whispered secrets of admirals and diplomats, laid bare in meticulous decryption. The men do not speak. They simply stare at the message that has emerged from months of intellectual combat, a diplomatic cable from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, discussing terms that will never be met, negotiations that are already shadows of intention rather than substance. One cryptanalyst, a young mathematician named Frank Rowlett, exhales slowly. He knows what this means. He knows that somewhere across the Pacific, in harbors and anchorages whose names are not yet burned into American memory, a storm is gathering. And he knows that his government is reading the wind. This was the war before the war, the silent conflict waged not with battleships and bombers, but with pencils, probability theory, and the relentless human drive to pry open locked doors. For nearly 2 years before the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had been fighting a shadow campaign against one of the most sophisticated cipher systems ever devised. They called their achievement magic, the ability to read Japan's most secret diplomatic communications as clearly as if they had been addressed to Washington itself. It was an intelligence triumph of staggering proportions, one that should have granted the United States an unassailable advantage in the looming conflict. Yet it was also a tragedy of misunderstanding, institutional rigidity, and the fatal human tendency to see only what one expects to see. The Japanese, for their part, possessed their own cryptanalytic capabilities, their own brilliant minds trained in the dark arts of codebreaking. But in the calculus of intelligence priorities, in the allocation of resources and respect, Tokyo's leadership made a choice that would echo through the annals of military history. They believed their codes were unbreakable. They believed their enemies were too unsophisticated, too scattered, too inferior to penetrate the mathematical fortresses they had constructed. And in that belief, they walked blindfolded into the abyss. The story of magic is not merely a tale of technical achievement. It is a meditation on hubris and humility, on the fatal gap between perception and reality, and on how empires fall not only through the clash of arms, but through the silent erosion of secrecy. It is the story of how Japan ignored its own codebreakers, dismissed the possibility of compromise, and sailed toward catastrophe, with its most vital communications exposed to the enemy's gaze, an enemy they had underestimated in every conceivable way. In the late 1930s, as the shadows of war lengthened across Asia and Europe, the Japanese Empire stood at a crossroads of technological and strategic ambition. Japan had transformed itself in less than a century from a feudal society into a modern industrial power, one capable of projecting military force across thousands of miles of ocean. Its navy was among the finest in the world, its army battle-hardened from years of brutal conflict in China, its industrial base expanding rapidly despite limited natural resources. But Japan's leaders understood that modern warfare required more than steel and firepower. It required information, timely, accurate, and secret. It required the ability to communicate across vast distances without the enemy intercepting or understanding those communications. And so, like every major power of the era, Japan invested heavily in cryptography, the science of concealing meaning within apparently meaningless symbols. The Japanese diplomatic service relied primarily on a cipher machine known as the Type B cipher machine, or Engoki Type B, in Japanese nomenclature. To the Americans, who eventually broke it, this device and the coded messages it produced would become known simply as Purple. The Purple machine was an electromechanical marvel, a sophisticated device that used telephone stepping switches to scramble messages through multiple layers of transposition and substitution. Unlike the German Enigma machine, which used rotors, Purple employed a more complex system that Japanese engineers believed made it virtually impregnable to cryptanalytic attack. Messages encrypted by Purple were transmitted via commercial cable companies or radio broadcast, reaching Japanese embassies and consulates around the world. These communications contained the empire's most sensitive diplomatic correspondence, negotiations, strategic assessments, intelligence reports, and the careful positioning that preceded acts of war. In Tokyo, within the Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus and the Foreign Ministry's communications security sections, there were men who understood cryptography's double edge. Japan had its own codebreakers, mathematicians and linguists who had achieved notable successes against Chinese and Soviet communications. They knew that any cipher, no matter how complex, was theoretically vulnerable to sustained analytical assault. Some among them harbored quiet concerns about Purple's security. But these concerns existed in an institutional culture that prized confidence, decisiveness, and the unquestioning acceptance of official assurances. When engineers demonstrated Purple's complexity, when security officials assured their superiors that breaking such a cipher would require resources and mathematical sophistication beyond America's capabilities, those assurances were accepted. The alternative, that Japan's most secret communications might already be compromised, was simply too uncomfortable to seriously contemplate. The Japanese understood Americans through a lens distorted by racial prejudice and cultural superiority. In the strategic assessments produced by Tokyo's military planners, America appeared as a nation of individualists lacking martial spirit, a polyglot society weakened by democracy and materialism, a people too soft and pleasure-seeking to endure the sacrifices of total war. This perception extended to American intellectual capabilities. How could a nation so devoted to jazz, Hollywood, and commercial excess produce the disciplined, systematic minds necessary for advanced cryptanalysis? How could a military establishment fragmented between Army and Navy, riddled with political interference, match the focused intensity of Japan's warrior culture? These questions were asked rhetorically, their answers assumed. And in that assumption lay a fatal blindness. What the Japanese leadership failed to grasp was that American cryptanalysis was not a mirror of American society's surface characteristics. It was instead a reflection of the nation's deepest strengths. Its universities that fostered pure mathematical research without immediate military application. Its culture of innovation that encouraged unorthodox approaches. Its ability to recruit brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds and give them resources without demanding ideological conformity. The men and women who would break Purple were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, linguists, chess players, puzzle enthusiasts, people drawn to cryptanalysis not by martial glory, but by intellectual challenge. And they were supported by an industrial base capable of producing specialized machinery, by academic institutions that understood probability theory and statistical analysis, by a governmental structure that, despite its flaws, recognized the value of intelligence, even when that intelligence contradicted comfortable assumptions. November 1938. The basement of the munitions building. A team of American cryptanalysts gathers around the components of a partially reconstructed cipher machine. They have never seen a Purple device. Japan guards its cipher machines as zealously as it guards its naval battle plans. What they have instead are intercepted messages, thousands of them, accumulating like sediment. And they have something else, the memory of Red, Purple's predecessor. For years, American codebreakers had successfully read encrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic. Then, in February 1939, Japan introduced a new system. The messages suddenly became gibberish. The cryptanalysts knew this meant a fundamental change, not merely a new code, but a new machine with a new logical architecture. Frank Rowlett, William Friedman, and their colleagues faced a challenge that seemed almost insurmountable: to reconstruct the internal logic of a device they had never seen, using only the encrypted outputs and the shadows of mathematical pattern. They expected failure, or at best, years of grinding incremental progress. What they achieved instead was one of the most remarkable intellectual feats of the 20th century. Without access to the physical machine, without spies providing blueprints or stolen components, American cryptanalysts reverse-engineered Purple's logical structure through pure analysis. They studied message formats, looking for regularities. They exploited the fact that diplomatic messages often contain predictable elements, dates, formal greetings, standard phrases. They used statistical analysis to identify which parts of messages remained constant, which varied, and how those variations correlated with known plaintext. Month by month, the fog began to clear. By August 1940, less than 18 months after Purple's introduction, the Americans had constructed their own analog of the Japanese cipher machine, not identical in physical form, but functionally equivalent, capable of decrypting Purple traffic as readily as the machine in Tokyo could encrypt it. The achievement was staggering, yet it brought no celebration, only the grim satisfaction of work accomplished and the immediate pressure of exploitation. A special intelligence distribution system was established. Decrypted Japanese diplomatic messages were given the code name Magic, and access was restricted to the highest levels of the American government: the President, the Secretaries of State, War and Navy, and a handful of senior military commanders. The distribution was so tightly controlled that even many senior officers remained unaware of Magic's existence. Security was paramount. If Japan discovered that Purple had been compromised, they would immediately change systems, and the Americans would lose their window into Japanese strategic thinking. And what a window it was! Through Magic, the United States read Japan's diplomatic assessments of European powers, its negotiations with Germany and Italy, its internal debates about strategy in China and Southeast Asia. American officials watched as Tokyo's positions hardened, as diplomatic language grew more strident, as the possibility of peaceful resolution receded like a tide drawing back before a tsunami. They read Ambassador Nomura's reports from Washington, noting with grim irony that they often understood Tokyo's negotiating position before Japan's own diplomats in America did. They saw the empire's resource calculations, its awareness that economic sanctions were slowly strangling its war machine, its growing conviction that military action was inevitable. Yet here the story takes its first tragic turn. Intelligence, no matter how perfect, is worthless if it is not understood, believed, and acted upon. The Magic decrypts were not self-interpreting. They were fragments of a larger picture, puzzle pieces that required context and analysis to yield meaning. And the context within which American officials interpreted Magic was shaped by their own assumptions, their own institutional cultures, their own expectations of how Japan would behave. When decrypted messages spoke of Japan's determination to secure resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, American planners assumed this meant an attack on British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, not a simultaneous assault on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. When diplomatic traffic indicated a deadline approaching at the end of November 1941, officials interpreted this as meaning negotiations would break down, not that military operations were already in motion. Magic provided transparency into Japanese diplomatic thinking, but it could not break the invisible walls of assumption and prejudice that shaped how that information was received. Moreover, Magic had a crucial limitation. It revealed diplomatic communications, but not military plans. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained its own code systems, entirely separate from the Foreign Ministry's Purple machine. Naval codes, especially the main operational code system known as JN-25, were vastly more difficult to break, and American progress against them was limited and fragmentary in 1941. So while the United States could read what Japanese diplomats were saying to each other, it could not read what Japanese admirals were ordering their fleets to do. The result was a strange, partial vision, clarity on strategic intent, but blindness to tactical execution. It was like watching a man's face as he decides to draw a weapon, but not being able to see his hand move toward the holster. December 6, 1941. The Navy Department Building, Washington. Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer, a Japanese language officer serving as a Magic courier, receives the first 13 parts of a 14-part Japanese diplomatic message. It is a lengthy document, Tokyo's response to the latest American negotiating position. Kramer reads through the decrypt, his trained eye catching the formal, final tone. This is not a message that anticipates further discussion. This is a message that closes doors. He prepares the material for distribution, placing the decrypted text in locked portfolios for delivery to authorized recipients. That evening, President Roosevelt reads the 13 parts. He turns to Harry Hopkins, his closest advisor, and speaks words that will be remembered. This means war. But war when? War where? The message contains no military details, no operational timing. And the 14th part, the conclusion, has not yet been transmitted. The Japanese expected their security to hold. They expected that when Ambassador Nomura delivered Tokyo's final message to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, it would be a revelation, a dramatic moment of declared intent. They did not know that American officials had already read the message hours before it was delivered, had already absorbed its meaning, had already begun, too late, to send warning orders to Pacific commands. They did not know that their most secret diplomatic cipher had been transparent to American eyes for over a year. They did not know because they had convinced themselves it was impossible. Their engineers had assured them. Their understanding of American capabilities had assured them. Their racial ideology had assured them. And so they sailed toward Pearl Harbor wrapped in a false cloak of invisibility, believing their attack would achieve total surprise, while their enemy was already reading their diplomatic farewell. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the 14th part of Tokyo's message arrived in Washington, along with a crucial instruction. The entire 14-part message was to be delivered to the American government at precisely 1 p.m. Eastern Time. American cryptanalysts working through the night decoded this timing message by early morning. An Army intelligence officer, Colonel Rufus Bratton, immediately recognized its significance. 1 p.m. in Washington was early morning in Hawaii, dawn, the perfect time for an attack. He rushed to send warnings to Pacific commands. But it was Sunday morning in Washington, and the secure communication systems were not fully staffed. Warnings went out by commercial telegraph. They were delayed, misdirected, caught in the peacetime routine of an administrative machinery not yet geared for war. When the Japanese bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor, the telegram warning of possible attack was still being processed for delivery. The attack, of course, was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. The Japanese achieved complete surprise, sinking or damaging 8 American battleships and destroying hundreds of aircraft. But they also unified American public opinion in a way no amount of diplomatic pressure could have achieved, transforming isolationist sentiment into righteous fury overnight. And they did it all while laboring under the delusion that their communications were secure, that their diplomatic maneuvering had been conducted in privacy, that they had concealed their intentions until the moment of execution. In reality, they had staged their approach to war under lights, reading from a script their enemy was also reading, playing to an audience that knew the ending before the curtain rose. What the Japanese leadership failed to understand, what they could not understand within the cognitive framework they had constructed, was that American cryptanalysis was not merely a technical achievement, but a manifestation of a fundamentally different approach to knowledge and security. In Japan's hierarchical military culture, cryptography was the domain of specialists whose pronouncements were accepted by commanders without deep questioning. Security was maintained through compartmentalization, restricted access, and the assumption that proper procedure guaranteed protection. The notion that Purple might be vulnerable was not seriously investigated after its deployment, because such investigation would imply doubt in the system, and doubt undermined the confidence essential to military action. American intelligence culture, by contrast, was rooted in skepticism and continuous testing. Cryptanalysts like William Friedman approach ciphers not with reverence, but with the assumption that any system created by human minds could be unraveled by human minds. The American effort against Purple was not a single brilliant insight, but a sustained campaign of intellectual siege. Months of 12-hour days, countless false starts, the systematic elimination of possibilities, the building of statistical tools and conceptual frameworks that could reveal structure within apparent chaos. It was a collaboration between mathematicians who understood group theory and linguists who understood Japanese grammar, between engineers who could build specialized tabulating equipment and puzzle solvers who approach problems from oblique angles. It was, in essence, a demonstration of democracy's hidden advantage, the ability to mobilize diverse talents, to question authority, to pursue unorthodox methods, and to trust in intellectual merit regardless of rank or social position. Japan had brilliant cryptanalysts in its own right. The Imperial Navy's codebreaking section had achieved significant successes against British and Chinese communications. But these successes were not translated into institutional humility about Japanese cipher security. The assumption held, our codes are strong because our minds are disciplined, because our systems are rigorous, because we are Japanese. This was not merely nationalism, but a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that the enemy might possess equal or superior capabilities in domains where Japan had invested pride and identity. And so warnings from Japan's own cryptanalysts, cautious suggestions that purple security be reevaluated, were not vigorously pursued. To do so would have been to admit vulnerability, to introduce doubt into the supreme confidence necessary for Japan's audacious strategic gamble. The magic decrypts continued throughout the war, expanding as American cryptanalysts broke additional Japanese cipher systems. By 1943, the United States was reading not only diplomatic traffic, but also substantial portions of Japanese naval and military communications. The intelligence derived from these sources, collectively known as Ultra in the Pacific, though that term is more commonly associated with German Enigma decrypts, shaped American strategy at every level. It guided submarine deployments, allowing American subs to position themselves along Japanese convoy routes revealed through decoded messages. It enabled the ambush and destruction of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft in April 1943, when decrypted flight plans revealed precisely where the architect of Pearl Harbor would be flying. It provided advance warning of Japanese defensive preparations, attack plans, and resource shortages. The United States fought the Pacific War with an intelligence advantage so comprehensive that it bordered on precognition. Not perfect, not without failures and misinterpretations, but so far superior to Japan's intelligence position that the two sides were fighting fundamentally different wars. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to achieve comparable intelligence penetration. Japanese cryptanalysts worked against American codes with dedication and skill, but they faced a more fundamental problem. American cryptographic security improved continuously throughout the war, incorporating lessons learned and technological advances. Moreover, American communications security doctrine emphasized regular code changes, operational security, and the assumption that any system might be compromised. The paranoia that had protected magic before the war continued to protect American communications during it. Japan achieved tactical intelligence successes, identifying American unit locations, reading some lower-level code systems, but never gained the strategic transparency that magic provided to the United States. They fought blind against an enemy who could see, and in modern warfare, that disparity is almost always fatal. The symbolic object that runs through this story is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a sheet of paper. The decrypt itself, the typed page that emerges from cryptanalytic labor bearing information that was never meant to be read. These sheets accumulated in classified files, thousands upon thousands of them, each representing a small victory in the silent war. They were boring documents, often filled with diplomatic boilerplate and administrative detail. But scattered among the routine were the revelations, the strategic assessments, the operational timelines, the moments of unguarded frankness, when Japanese officials discussed their fears and limitations. Each sheet was a small breach in the wall of secrecy, and collectively they opened a window through which American commanders could observe the enemy's thinking in something close to real time. The decrypt, mundane, technical, easy to overlook in the drama of combat, was the weapon that won the intelligence war, and in doing so, shaped the entire conflict. August 14, 1945. The White House Map Room. The final magic decrypt of the war arrives. Tokyo's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, Japan's surrender. The war that began with magic's revelation of Japanese intentions ends with magic's revelation of their concession. The circle is complete. The cryptanalysts, who have labored in obscurity for 4 years, whose work was so classified that even after victory they cannot speak of it publicly, allow themselves a moment of satisfaction. They have fought a war that history will barely record, achieved victories that will be classified for decades. And they have demonstrated a truth that empires ignore at their peril, that confidence without verification is delusion, that secrecy is not security, that the assumption of technical superiority is the beginning of catastrophe. The story of magic and Japan's cryptographic blindness is not ultimately about technology. It is about perception, how nations see themselves and their adversaries, how institutions process uncomfortable information, how confidence becomes its own vulnerability. Japan entered the Pacific War believing in its own invincibility, its codes unbreakable, its enemies inferior in discipline and spirit. It fought that war with its diplomatic communications completely transparent to American intelligence, its naval codes heavily compromised, its plans and intentions known to an enemy who used that knowledge with devastating effectiveness. The empire's strategic vision was thus doubly blind to the material and industrial realities that made American victory inevitable, and blind to the intelligence asymmetry that allowed America to fight the war with an advantage that Japan never fully grasped. The codebreakers who achieved magic did not win the war alone. Cryptanalysis, no matter how brilliant, does not capture islands or sink ships. But they changed the fundamental equation of the conflict, transforming it from a contest of blind forces groping toward each other into something closer to a chess game, where one player can see the board and the other cannot. They did this not through superhuman genius, but through systematic effort, institutional support, technological resources, and a cultural willingness to question authority and pursue unorthodox approaches. They demonstrated that democracy's apparent chaos, its competing institutions, its tolerance for dissent, its elevation of merit over rank, could produce decisive advantage in realms where authoritarian efficiency was expected to dominate. For Japan, the failure was not technical but conceptual. The engineers who designed Purple were highly skilled. The cryptanalysts who worked for the Imperial Navy were capable professionals. But they operated within a system that could not accommodate the possibility of its own vulnerability, that could not question the assurances of authority, that could not imagine the enemy might be more capable than ideology suggested. And so they sailed into the abyss, reading from plans that their enemies had already read, making decisions that were already known, fighting battles that were lost before they began, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because their commanders lacked information while their enemies possessed it in abundance. The legacy of magic extends far beyond World War II. It established American signals intelligence as a permanent institution, laying groundwork for the National Security Agency and the vast electronic surveillance apparatus of the Cold War and beyond. It demonstrated that information could be a weapon as decisive as any physical armament, that the secret war of code-breaking and communication security was not ancillary to military operations, but central to them. It showed that assumptions about enemy capabilities were dangerous, that continuous testing and paranoid security were necessary, that the war of invisible symbols was as real and consequential as the war of visible force. The decrypt lies in an archive now, yellowed paper in a classified file. One small fragment of the massive documentary record of a war fought 3/4 of a century ago. The machines that created it, both Purple and its American analog, are museum pieces, relics of an era when cryptography meant physical devices and mechanical ingenuity. But the truth the decrypt represents remains current, that empires rise and fall not only through military might, but through information and understanding, that the ability to see clearly while one's enemy sees dimly is perhaps the most decisive advantage in human conflict, that the assumption of security is the beginning of vulnerability. Japan's codebreakers possessed the skills to break magic, but they were never asked to seriously try. And in that failure to question, to test, to doubt the assurances of authority and the comforts of ideology, an empire sealed its fate. The decrypt is silent now, but its lesson echoes still. in every assumption of technical superiority, in every confidence that one's secrets are safe, in every failure to imagine that the enemy might be more capable than we wish to believe. The paper remembers what pride forgets, that in the invisible war, blindness is fatal, and the empire that cannot see its own vulnerability has already begun to fall.